Mary Hynes-Berry and Rocky Dodia from Erickson's Early Math Collective will be exploring the strong connections between language and cognitive development that leads to true number sense. The more very young children play and are engaged in math conversations, the more likely they are to enter preschool fully primed to count and take on other mathematical tasks. Join them for More, said the baby, how language and math work together in the thinking of infants and toddlers. Welcome, Mary and Rocky.
So, welcome to More, said the baby, how language and math work together in the thinking of infants and toddlers. I'm Mary Hynes-Berry from Erickson Institute, and I'm very delighted to be here with my very wonderful comrade and co-thinker.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rocky Dodia, and I work with Mary on this really wonderful work that we do with 0 to 3 children. We're really excited to share some of what we've been working on these last 3 years.
So actually going on 6, kind of.
Yes, that's right. For me, 3. For Mary, much, much longer.
Yeah. So just think about it. What do you want more of? That's kind of a complicated question because there are all kinds of more that we might want. There's quantitative more, magnitude, and then there's qualitative. So, Rocky, what do you want more of?
Mary, what I would really love more of is just time to myself. Actually, just 20 minutes of time to myself because I live with young children right now.
Oh, yeah, I remember the day. So basically what you want is somewhere between quantitative and magnitude. Mm-hmm. You want a greater amount. You're willing to settle for more, but you're quite willing to be settled for at least 20 minutes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for me, it's a little bit different. What I really want is more high quality time, especially with the youngest grandchild who lives down the street. Because now all we're doing is waving from the porch, and we used to cook together and do our projects together, and we started sewing together. So I want more time when we can be really interacting.
I'm sure there are so many people listening right now that can relate to that, Mary.
Yeah. And that's really basically a qualitative kind of more. And, you notice that when it's the qualitative, it has that emotional, both of them do actually, both of them do, but there's sort of an emotional drive often in the qualitative.
Absolutely.
So we've got this wonderful new word that everybody in our project loves. It's called tracio. All humans, all of the babies that you see, the little baby birds, the human baby, the chimp baby, all of them are tracio, but the human baby is the most tracio of all. And what that means is that they have to be nurtured to develop, to grow and to thrive. And if they don't get nurtured and they don't get that nourishment of love, affection, and guidance, the fact is they simply don't survive, much less thrive.
Absolutely. This is one of my favorite words that I've learned in this work that we've done, is this acknowledgement that nurturing is critically important.
Yes, absolutely. So that nurturing has to start in the earliest lifetime. And it has to start across all the domains. It has to be part of their physical development and growth, their cognitive growth, and very definitely of their language growth and development, as well as of their social emotional growth and development. And so it has to happen, but it doesn't happen in a way that we say, okay, baby, now I'm giving you some physical nourishment. Okay, baby, now I'm giving you some cognitive nourishment. Okay, baby, now I'm giving you some you know, language development, nourishment, watch this flashcard, that doesn't work.
Right.
It has to come together.
Mm-hmm. And this next slide, Mary, is one of my favorites. So one of the things that Mary is talking about is how important it is on a brain-based level. So it's not just us saying children need to feel nurtured. It actually is priming their brain to learn. So no matter how young or old we are, even as adults, we all need to feel engaged, safe, valued, and competent in order to take in new information and process the world. And these positive feelings about yourself are very much dependent on the nurturing that Mary was just speaking about.
Absolutely.
So it's really important to consider nurturing in the world that we live in right now. So it says nurturing means more of interacting with a caring human being and rather than a screen. So in the last 10 years, we know that children are interacting with screens more in the last 10 years than they have ever before. And that this is a really important thing to consider in terms of development, because there is no replacement for a face-to-face interaction. And this research that you can look more into, we definitely put it in our handout if you're interested in reading the full report. But it talks about specifically 2 to 5 year olds and the impact, the negative impact that 2 to 3 hours of daily screen time has on communication, pre-literacy, and motor development. And I think one of the really important things to consider is what are the missed opportunities for young children when they are in front of a screen, right? There's missed opportunities to interact interpersonally, motor development-wise, and just communication interaction. So it's not as if you also have to consider the time spent that would have been spent with interactive experiences.
Absolutely. So important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So although this is not a presentation about specifically physical or communicative development, it's really helpful to think about these two domains as Mary and I get deeper into math development, because we know that physical development, we have a reverence for the time span that it takes for a young child to learn how to eventually walk. We know that it begins with many, many weeks of pulling up their head, and then weeks that it takes to roll, to turn over, eventually able to stand up on all fours, crawl, and then take their first steps, right? Incredible amount of time, space, and interaction involved in those physical milestones. And same with communication, right? Young children need to have many months of cooing and crying and then babbling even within that, in order to begin to speak expressively in full sentences. So neither one of these two things can happen, or neither one of these two can be expedient. We can't make these happen faster by showing them flashcards or videos. That simply won't help these skills develop. But what will help them develop these is knowing where they are on the pathway and then giving them the time and space to just experience them. And this is very much true for math and cognition, as we're going to get into today.
Absolutely. So while human infants, they're slower to develop physically, and their communication skills also take time to develop, but by the time they're 3, the human capacity to express thoughts and to create representations is greater than that of any other creature. And as we'll go on to see, this is really important. In our next slide, we can see that development really depends on nurturing. So in our program, we know that infants are born hardwired with instincts that are related both to mathematical thinking and language, but these capacities are immature. They're in a precursor stage. And what precursor means is what comes before and prepares or signals for something that is about to come. When the trees turn red or the leaves turn red and start to fall, we know that winter's on its way, especially if we're here in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
And so the winter isn't here yet, it's coming. That same thing happens with the precursors of cognition and language. They develop together. And what we're focusing on is what that means when we come to specifically mathematical thinking and learning. In mathematics, these precursor concepts are understandings that I think of as underlying, as kind of preparing the ground for the mathematical big ideas that develop in the early school years, that is, for 3 to 6 year olds.
I think that's a really important point, and why it's misunderstood, because you can't see all of this beautiful nurturing that's happening.
That's right.
And it takes a long time for it to develop.
Absolutely, yes. So we've identified these 4 precursor concepts: attribute, comparison, pattern, and change. These are instincts that we have to understand what are the properties of things, how are things same and different, what are the things that recur, and how does change go into this? And that becomes mathematical in a way that goes back not to our definition, which is mathematical thinking and problem solving is a logical way of thinking that allows for increasing precision. So mathematical thinking and these precursor concepts are what happens in our brain. And the more we develop the capacity to be logical, then the more we can be precise. So, of course, there's this rule. Use it or lose it. Without nurturing, the ground won't be prepared so that the seeds of mathematical thinking can take root and develop. It has to happen at the beginning. In fact, even before the baby's born.
Mm-hmm.
So nurturing the PMCs, Rocky, you really understand this, right?
Absolutely. And I do think it's important to note that Mary, you started your work with preschoolers 3 to 5. And you really, over the course of time, realize that it really does begin at the beginning, that infants really do have these innate capacities that we can nurture and prepare them for when they do get to these deeper mathematical principles.
Absolutely.
And so, yes, this idea of nurturing the PMCs, and PMCs, as Mary just mentioned, stands for Precursor Math Concepts. So they're not, maybe this might be a concept you've never thought about before, this idea of a precursor math concept, but it's really integral to what we're talking about. So it doesn't mean that we're instructing infants or toddlers on how to count or to name shapes, but it does mean, what it means is that we are taking advantage of everyday interactions to engage in what we call conversational math. And what we mean by conversational math is that it's purposeful, so it's meaningful to young children, and that it's playful in nature. So it's joyful. It's things that happen every day in your home, like doing the dishes, folding the laundry, doling out snacks. All of these things that are a part of your everyday are these secret windows into nurturing mathematical thinking. So it's not hiding in any manufactured math kit. It's actually just living in your world, which is the really great thing about sharing this work.
You're so right. It's really, I love that. It's not hiding there. It's not like hide and seek. And while we are coming up with these ideas and putting them kind of into words and into a theory, humans have known this for all along. Yeah. They've known that if you want to nurture growth and development across all the domains, you just have to love that baby.
Absolutely.
You have to talk to that baby. You have to hug that baby. Mm-hmm. You have to give that baby more.
Yeah. And hopefully this is provoking your thinking about what is math. I think we have a really narrow understanding of mathematics. And hopefully what we're able to inspire in you today is that it really truly is everywhere. And when you're working with infants and toddlers, you can capitalize on that because they're so curious and so interested in the world around them.
Absolutely. So here we're just giving you a few words. And in the handouts, we've offered you a little bit of a bookmark. The more you say more, the more the mathematical understanding grows. But one of the things that's really amazing is you start to think about how often do you say more in your daily life? You say it all the time. Every time you say it, you're talking mathematical. You're having that conversational math.
Absolutely. This is such a great way to get you thinking about how many ways there really is to talk about how big something is.
So rather than just talking all about this, let's try something. Let's see how you can get this idea that the math is all around us and it's in our bodies and our faces and our gestures. So I'm going to have everybody do what we call a narrative pantomime. And Rocky's going to be doing it for you on screen. Mm-hmm. I'm going to read from this absolutely wonderful book called More, More, More by Vera Williams. It's been out for about 50 years, and it's been a treasure ever since. As I read, I'm not showing you the pictures because I want you to get them into your head and into your body. Mm-hmm. And so you act out whatever you hear, whether it's one character or another character, and just sort of feel what this story is telling us. Now, this is Little Pumpkin. Little Pumpkin scoots away so fast. Little Pumpkin's grandma has to run like anything just to catch that baby up. But Little Pumpkin's grandma, she catches that baby up all right. She holds that baby nose to nose and swings that baby all around. Oh, my best little pumpkin baby, Little Pumpkin's grandma says. And she sings to Little Pumpkin, just look at you with your 10 little toes, right on the ends, right on the ends, right on the ends of your 2 little feet. Good enough to eat, good enough to eat. Then Little Pumpkin's grandma brings that baby right up close and tastes each of Little Pumpkin's toes. More, laughs Little Pumpkin. More, more, more. I hope you had fun.
That's so great. So one of the reasons we wanted to share this really beautifully, really timeless book is we want to inspire your thinking about what are some of the different ways that you heard more. The title of the book is More, 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 said the baby, right? So this is a really important concept that the book brings out, but it does it in such a beautiful and playful way. And this is something that we feel really deeply about, is that when you can engage in this kind of conversation. So this is what we mean by conversational math. In this section of the book that Mary read out loud is such a wonderful embodiment of what conversational math can sound like. And in the text, there was more examples of more as quantity, when she was looking at her toes. There was examples of more as size or magnitude. There was examples of more of experiencing and exploring spatial relationships when she was swinging her around and running after her and scooping her up, maybe how tight she was holding her. And of possibly even more, there was some rich social emotional more support. And here is just some images from the book that you can see how it's laid out. And I want you to think about this page where it says right on the ends, right on the ends, right on the ends of your 2 little feet, good enough to eat. So you can, there's such a great example of what is the more that grandma is after, and what is the more that the baby is interested in. Is the baby, when the baby says more, 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 is she saying she wants more toes? Or is when grandma saying more, 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 does she want her to have more little fingers on her toes? Of course not, right? She means more. She wants more of that experience. And I'm sure all of you that work with infants and toddlers or live with infants and toddlers have heard them say, when you do share an experience with them, they are almost always, when they enjoy it, saying more and more and more, right? Because they really crave that repetitive experience. And so this is often a word we hear them say quite early on in their language development.
In fact,
go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, no, I think you're saying this so beautifully, Rocky.
Thanks, Mary.
It is really such a proof of what we said earlier, which is that we cannot separate those mores. We can't separate the idea of quantity or magnitude from the idea of qualitative wanting more, the higher quality, and from the social emotional development. That baby's going to learn, as you say, is going to be willing to learn about more in a more precise way, simply because she's had all these playful experiences. And I think that leads to our next point, which is that the precursor mathematical concepts lead to number sense. They depend, but number sense itself only happens when symbolic thinking starts to happen. It doesn't even emerge until 2 years of age. Past Little Pumpkin's age there, typically children are close to 3 before their ability to generalize means that they can actually count and understand that when you say 3, you mean 3 of something. And so instead, this next slide will show us what begins in the earliest years is how well the mamas, the grandpas, the grandmas, the loving caregivers nurture what we call approximate number sense. In other words, understanding that something is more in quantity or in magnitude, but without precision. And we were talking about a wonderful example that you have with your daughter who's just 3.
She's just 3, and there's been so many examples where I've seen where she's approximating number sense. And because I have this background with Mary on really studying this idea of how infants and toddlers develop this, I have a little bit of window into her thinking. So when she was 2, she used to rattle off these numbers at count, and it sounded like she was counting. So she might say 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, 10. And all of the people in my life, all the grandparents and the aunts and the cousins would say, wow, she can count. I can't. How did you teach her how to count? And of course, my response was, she's not counting. She's just mimicking what her older brother is saying. And she knows that she's going to get a response from an adult when she rattles off these words in a certain order. Then she knows that that's something that's valuable and that people want to hear, but she wasn't actually counting anything. She was just kind of saying the numbers in sort of an order. And so that's a really good example of approximate number sense. She didn't quite fully grasp what those numbers meant, but she knew that it was something that was valued.
And when we were talking about this before, you pointed out that her older brother didn't show that same sign of genius.
Absolutely.
because nobody was thinking to particularly say the numbers to him.
Exactly.
And it might not have made much difference, because we know that young children count so much on what they learn from the children who are closer to their age. I'm one of a very large family, and it seemed like the further you got down the line, the faster some of these concepts came, because they were hearing the older kids do all kinds of things.
Yes, it's really such a great example of how much you learn through social interaction, and by watching and listening and observing what other kids are doing and then trying it out.
Absolutely.
And I think you make a really good point, Mary. It's not as if they have that number sense, because a 2-year-old can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 doesn't equate to number sense. We can possibly say maybe 1, 2, or 3, but beyond that, not quite.
Well, actually, when you think about it, as the next slide shows, in the very beginning, the brain really follows this, what we call this learning trajectory. It happens at different stages. It happens at a different pathway for different children, but it always goes from that sort of emerging to developing to transforming. So in the next slide, we'll look at what happens with the babies. And so infants and toddlers can't count. They cannot do math. They can perceive quantity or magnitude. And perception is really a different thing. Perception means that you notice and that you remember. But what you remember is very sensory. You remember sensations. You remember persons and things. You remember experiences. Just as Rava just kept hearing her older brother do that counting, she remembered it. She saw it, got a lot of approval, and she went for it.
Absolutely.
So we really have to remember how important it is that learning begins with the perceptive stage. But just because we notice something doesn't mean that we are capable of intentionally thinking or understanding. That's true for babies.
Mm-hmm. This perceptive stage, Mary, is something the teachers, caregivers that I work with, that work with 0 to 3, really find this stage to be helpful to understand and empowering, because they realize there's a connection that you make when you realize there's a whole stage of learning where you're just taking in and noticing and perceiving, and that's an important stage. It's not relegated as unimportant, but that it really is something that's not as valued in the stages of learning. So I'm really glad that we're able to talk about this.
Me too, and I'm thinking, Rocky, of how in our learning labs, what we hear again and again from the caregivers is, as you say, oh, I didn't realize, but now I see that the more I talk to the baby about what they notice, then the sharper their noticing gets. Yeah. And they also say, I just get so delighted by what those babies can do. When I'm looking at what they can do and not, are they doing the next thing yet?
Yes, and also really wonderfully examples in the read aloud that you just did. How much Little Pumpkin didn't say a whole lot, but she was perceiving and feeling and remembering those experiences.
Absolutely. So they, in the infant stage, they don't differentiate. They don't differentiate cognitively at all between more as quantity, more as magnitude or size, or more as intensity of sensation. But it isn't intentional, but they feel it. Mm-hmm. However, as this next, we both talked about how much we love this image.
Yes. Oh, it's so rich. Especially now that it's summer in Chicago, you can really actually see the trees, and sometimes you actually see the roots growing out of the ground. And it really is a helpful way to think about how the trajectory of learning that infants go through from infancy up until preschool.
Absolutely. The tree and the brain. So now we get to toddlers. And so toddlers, it covers a huge range. We say 12 to 24 months, but some kids are edging into it at even 10, 11 months. Mm-hmm. And some kids are still in that wonderful stage well over 2. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we appreciate the child where they are, and we appreciate how much develops in this point. So toddlers can't count either, but they can develop receptive understanding of what it means to count. That is, that count words have something to do with answering the question, how many of what? So I would bet even money, although I didn't ask you this before, Rocky, that if somebody said to Rava, what color is that? She didn't say 1, 2, 3, 4.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. She would say a color.
she would say a color. So she knew that count words have something to do with counting.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the research is very, very clear.
Mm-hmm.
The more that children hear count words used meaningfully, then the better that they begin to develop that number sense, and the more quickly it just sort of, clicks in once they get to that stage.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and it goes back to what we were saying about meaningful, purposeful experiences, that the more it actually is rooted in their world, in their everyday life, whether it's the counting, the things that they do every day, if it was plates in the kitchen that they're counting, whatever it is, as long as it's meaningful to them, then that unlocks the power of these, what do these words mean and how do I attach them to objects?
That's such a great example, Rocky, because what you're saying is, again, that it's the social emotional force that comes with these things that makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah.
That's why Rava says those words, because of the reception she gets, and because of the feeling she gets. I'm like my big brother.
Exactly. Yeah. When we don't even need to say what is important to us, they figure that out very quickly.
Absolutely. So they are beginning to develop this realizing that more is quantity is different from more as magnitude or size, or more as intensity of sensation. And I was telling you about this granddaughter who lives down the street. When she was she was approaching 18 months, and she went off to visit her other grandparents. And before that, I'd been sort of keeping records of, what she was doing and saying. And she would talk about how things were big. It's big, it's big, it's big. And when she came back, all of a sudden, she was telling me things were too big. And I realized, and actually I was talking with Barbara Abel, who's our really such an insightful 0 to 3 educator. And she said, well, that's what happens, is that as the symbolic thinking comes in, they can move from just saying something's big to kind of comparing. And the interesting thing is they're always going to compare going for what's big. So they'll say too big, but she never said too little.
Interesting. So this idea that there's what's the difference between, and I think that's actually our next side, between big and too big. I think to some, if you hear a child like your granddaughter saying big and then all of a sudden using too big, you might not notice how the cognitive shift that happens between those two concepts, because it sounds almost the same. But there's a comparison happening. So there's an incredible amount of mathematical thinking involved in saying something is big versus something is too big.
Yeah. That's, you've got, you said that really well. It's the cognitive shift, and it's very subtle. And if all we're looking for is getting kids to say the number names from 1 to 10, we miss the beauty of the mathematical thinking.
Absolutely. And as we're talking about this idea of big and more, think back to when you get a chance to your handout with all of those beautiful, precise words of the different ways to say big, whether you're talking about quantity, whether you're talking about spatial. So like even that word big has so much that you can sink your teeth into mathematically as a toddler. And I think hopefully that's a new way for you to think about this idea of what math conversation is.
I'm so glad you said that, because what we want to have happen is we want caregivers to kind of ban big and talk instead about tall or deep or wide. And we know that children learn so much from the nonverbals, so they learn so much from our gestures, as well as they learn from our facial expression and just sort of the whole way that we show, oh yeah, that's too big.
Yeah, absolutely. And the amount of abstract thinking it takes to wrap your brain around two different ways something can be big. So if you have an older sister, but you're taller than your older sister, then you might say, I'm bigger than her. But what kind of bigger? You're saying you're taller than her, but you're not older than her. And that's tricky to make sense of when you're only looking at the size difference.
And actually, that doesn't really click until kids are at 5 or 6, you know, I think. So there's a lot of research that we won't go into, but the research does show that the more that toddlers see purposeful counting modeled and that they hear the cardinality expressed, then the better they do 2 years later when they're tested for their mathematical thinking. So it's really simple. It comes down to this. When I'm counting my fingers and I go, how many fingers do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's one way. But if I do this, how many fingers do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 5 fingers. Expressing the cardinality is incredibly effective in developing kids' later mathematical thinking, because it means that they tie those number words to how many of what.
It's a really subtle difference, but it's incredibly important for cardinality. Absolutely, Mary.
Yep. So now we get to 3s. And if 3s' mathematical thinking has been nurtured from birth and their understanding has been allowed to follow that wonderful, complicated, wandering trajectory from perceptive to receptive to expressive productive, they can count, especially for very small quantities. They know that counting tells us how many of what. And they know the difference between being able to just rattle off the words, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and being able to respond if we ask them, so could you give me 4 napkins? Could you give me 4 crayons? It's when the child can answer that give me test that they truly have developed number sense.
Yes, we're talking about 3s as if they are college students, but when you're working with when you work with 0 to 3, 3 years old is a huge milestone. You've been on the earth for 3 years and you've had 3 years to grapple with all of these things in the world. And you've had all of these conversations with people. And then you get to actually, really make sense of that in a whole different way. So yeah, the 3-year-old teachers, we call them, those are the teachers that teach the old kids.
Yeah, they're like the really big kids. And so we keep saying this. Learners all follow the progression from perception to receptive understanding to expressive understanding, but each learner does find a unique pathway depending upon their individual strengths, needs, their context. And, the most important context is how much do we love that baby? How much do we pick that baby up and get them to say more, more, more? Absolutely.
It's really this idea of positive interactive communication and how that sows the seeds for future logical thinking. So you really have to take the long view.
Yeah. So if their mathematical thinking is nurtured from birth, then they can take on school math, but they take it on when they get to preschool. But the most important thing I think to think is that counting is part of the interesting conversations we can have about the math all around you. And so we're getting pretty close to our close, but we do want to show you a video. We're going to just show you part of it right now. You can see it on our website. But the important thing to think about with this video is that it shows children who are being nurtured by this wonderful teacher who has conversations about their lives and their thinking, and who follows their lead. And the one child who's about 4 months older than the other child, we can see she just loves to count, and she knows how to count, in fact, up to 10, even though she's only about 3 and a quarter or so.
Journey and Myra, a feast for 10. Remember we talked about where you think they're going, to the what? To the grocery store. One cart into the grocery store. How many grocery carts did we have?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
We have 6 people going to the grocery store. 2 pumpkin pies. Journey, how many pumpkins do we have?
2.
2 pumpkin pies. Can you
That
count?
says 2.
That says 2. That's the number 2.
Want to count them?
Yes, if you want to count them.
1 pumpkin pie, 1 pumpkin pie, apple.
Apple. It looks like an apple?
No.
What do it look like?
It looks like a pumpkin that you can eat it.
You can't eat it. It do look like something you can eat. But what do you think it could be?
It's ravioli.
Ravioli? It looks like it could be jelly.
Yes. It's just
It's jelly.
and
You
I
think
got
it's jelly?
bananas in that.
And what are those?
Chicken bird.
It's 3 chicken. 2,
1, 2, 3.
3. How
That says
many? 3. That
Three.
says 3.
Yeah.
We have 4 children off to look for
More.
more.
1, 2, 3, 4.
4. Good job, Amira. A sandwich. That's the bread. Now they put everything on the
want
table.
some.
You want some? You hungry?
Mhm.
It say 8 platters down.
Baby doll.
The baby might be waiting for mommy to come and get her. But we gonna see if she gonna be at the table to eat with everybody. And it says 9.
Baby doll?
She's the baby.
No, she's a girl.
Right, she's a girl, but it's one a little smaller than hers.
This the baby that she is 2.
She 2, and it's the
that
baby.
is just that though.
This is the sister. Is she a big sister or a little sister?
A big sister.
A big sister. What is she? What do you think she is?
A little sister.
A little sister. Well, what you think he is? Big or little? He a big brother. Look, he licking his tongue like this gonna be real good.
So we're going to stop it there, and hopefully you enjoyed going into this classroom and seeing this incredibly talented teacher.
Absolutely. Our time is just about up, but
Yep.
I'm just thinking, I hope that if you have questions and comments, and if you want to know more, we've given you some of the resources you can go look at. We would be absolutely delighted to respond. You'll get we've listed our email addresses, and of course, we strongly urge that you go to look at the earlymath.erickson.edu website, which is just full of things like this video. But I hope that, if nothing else, you go away with the idea of how wonderful it is to celebrate the more that is around us, and how every day that a child is alive, we see them learning and growing more. And the more that we communicate back to them, then the more their capacity will grow. Becky, is there anything you wanted to say?
No, I'm just smiling ear to ear listening to you talk, because I think that's a great way to end our talk. It was such a pleasure to share our work with you. And please do use our Erickson website, because we have a wonderful newsletter, lots of great resources for those of you that are supporting children at home. And that's about it.
Yeah, although, Rocky, I have to say, if they go, they can see you interacting with
That's
them.
right.
Yes.
That's right. I am on there living what it is to live with young children at home, and just trying to nurture and appreciate the small moments.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thank you all for your attention, and more. What can we say?
Yes. Have a great day, everyone.